the past couple of weeks, we have asked some big questions about the future of the church together. The first question we asked is, what will the church look like in the future? We explored what should die and what could live in regards to the church. The second question we asked is, how are we moving into that future? We explored two different images: Ezekiel's valley of dry bones and the church as a midwife, giving a sense of hope that life can be possible. This week, we continue our conversation. Does the church have a future and a hope? We will explore how understanding a bigger picture of our identity within the church helps us move to organize together as co-creators of the good and beautiful with God. As midwives, they give a sense of hope that the good and beautiful is possible. Today, I want to introduce you to some concepts and ideas that are part of how we are organizing folks as a community. Polycentric leadership and the 5 gifts known as APEST, which is an acronym for apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. Before I go any further, though, I want to give a shout out to J.R. Woodward and Dan White Jr. and their book, The Church's Movement. Many of the ideas that we will discuss are found their inspiration in that book. We are going to start with what J.R. and Dan call a 3-dimensional reading of Ephesians chapter 4. Everyone in the community is called. Everyone in the community has a ministry. Everyone in the community is a gift to the community that has something to help build up, equip, and teach us. Some of us show up as leaders, guides, and facilitators that help create space for the community to be empowered, encouraged, and equipped. That means that all of us in this community are called. All of us in this community have a ministry, and the leadership of this community has a role to empower, encourage, and equip us within the community for the ministry of co-creating the good and beautiful. I use the word within intentionally. Far too often, when we talk about the church leadership, they seem to be positioned over a community, but not within the community, from a hierarchical ladder with the guy on the top. Right? With that said, leaders in the community are not here to do ministry for you or to you, but with you. That is our posture. This probably sounds very different from how you've heard church leadership talked about before. In the tradition that I grew up in, the pastor, which tends to be a catch-all title for a leader in the church, is the professional minister in the community, the one that or the ones that minister to you and for you, the people in the church, in the community. But as we will see, as we continue to explore polycentric leadership and the 5 gifts, there is another way, perhaps even a better way, to organize leadership within the community to empower, encourage, and equip our community. Polycentric leadership is about distributing leadership throughout and within the community. The word poly means many. So polycentric leadership means many-centered leadership. And that's juxtaposed or compared to or contrasted with single-centered leadership. The idea of leading as a community from within the community. Moving away from the leader as CEO towards leaders as fellow members of the community who are helping one another to guide, facilitate, and create space for a more expansive representation of the church, a more expansive representation of the 5 gifts that Christ has given to the church. We often use the word accountable to talk about submission, right? Like, who are you accountable to? And accountability is good, but most of the time it is based in a one-way hierarchical relationship. Instead, we are called to mutuality, a mutual submission in polycentric leadership, meaning that when we come to the table together, submitted to one another, we are accountable to one another. I love this quote from the church's movement book. We must reimagine and reconstruct our leadership scaffolding to undo our over-individualized and over-professionalized leadership paradigms. Mutual leadership is an effort to share power among trust-soaked, vision-distributed, emotionally mature, Christ-rooted followers. For the sake of God's mission in the world, we need to distribute leadership. We still need structure. We still need scaffolding. Or to utilize another metaphor, the grapevines need trellises to reach their full potential. This begins when we recognize that we need all of the gifts: apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers in order for us to grow. Thus, we need each other because these gifts are distributed amongst us, but none of us has all of these gifts. We also need guides and facilitators who understand these gifts to help us set into motion the rest of the gifted body. These guides help us affirm, develop, and call forth the rest of the body into its giftedness. From the get-go, FOS was started with the idea of team-based leadership, even in its proto-FOS expressions. Now, this idea has grown and shifted over the years, and at times it has even been done really, really poorly. But it has always been at the forefront of how we envisioned this community. And to be frank, it is something that we have had to really hold on to because so many people in the early stages of this community demanded that a church has to have one leader with whom the buck stops. This is funny because nowhere in the New Testament church do you see a senior leader type of leadership practiced. But it is the normative practice today in the church. Another thing that we have sewn into the fabric of FOS from the inception is that we will always lead from within the community as part of the community. And I would add to that as we go forward, we are actually trying to see the community as leaders co-leading with one another as we move into the future. That is part of decentralizing and distributing leadership within the community, is that we all come to the table together and recognize that Christ is the head of the table. It is Christ's table. The table benefits from the activation of our giftedness as a whole and from the uniqueness of our voices that shape the table talk. We observe mutuality, diversity, accountability, gifting, and character in the New Testament. We must live into a community that models a mosaic of voices, even if it slows our pace. Polycentric leadership based on mutuality helps us pursue an emotionally healthy life together. We must work towards a shared rhythm of life that models mutual love, a servant posture, and a deep, forgiving friendship with one another as we go forward. I love this quote from Parker Palmer. "Before I can tell my life what I want to do with it, it is wise to listen to my life telling me who I am." Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13 says this: "He gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers. His purpose was to equip God's people for the work of serving and building up the body of Christ until we all reach the unity of faith and knowledge of God's Son. God's goal is for us to become mature adults, to be fully grown, measured by the standard of the fullness of Christ." All of us will find ourselves within these gifts. They are types, but they are expressed infinitely different as expressed through each one of us. And we will see and explore these gifts in more depth together. And if you want to read more about them, you can find detailed descriptions of each one of these gifts in the church's movement book. The goal of this talk wasn't to walk through a description of each of the gifts. We obviously didn't do that. But rather to help us paint a picture of why we need these gifts as part of our community. Joseph Campbell says this: if you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor. Well, in our case, maybe not the world, but at least our community. Christiana Rice is a pastor and practitioner that lives in San Diego. She introduced me to this concept based on this quote from Joseph Campbell: changing the metaphor. If we want to be a different kind of community, then we need to organize differently. We need different images, words, and metaphors for who we are, how we gather, and even how we see ourselves collectively and individually. And that is where we will go with APEST. It will give us new language, new images, and new metaphors to work with. We will allow an ancient text to help us shape our future together, to help us find ourselves, to help us identify the gifts each one of us brings to the table. And with that, I want to leave you with this quote from David Fitch's book, Faithful Presence. The world hungers for a new space of mutual understanding and blessing of each other's uniqueness, gifts, and cultural heritage. The world hungers for God's people being faithfully present to this reconciliation work of God in the world. And with that, we gather around this concept in order for us to go forward into the good and beautiful future together.